Hi all, welcome back. This part of the lecture, we're going to move into special senses. Okay, so we started off, we're talking about sensories in general, or your senses in general, the sensory system. We talked about general senses like thermoreceptors and nociceptors or pain receptors and kind of how they work in different regions. Now we're going to talk about special senses, senses that are associated mainly with the head and kind of how they work and what kind of determines the signals that are being sent in those regions. Okay, so first off, there are four main senses that are kind of associated with the head region, and these are normally called complex sensory organs. Okay, so you have smell, taste, hearing, vision. Okay, equilibrium is associated with hearing. Kind of, we're going to break them off a little bit, but realize that they're directly associated with each other. Okay, now sometimes we have something called synthesia, okay, or we have individuals in society that will make up senses. Okay, and the made up senses, it's not really being made up per se. It's because you're having a receptor send a signal to your brain. That portion of your brain often will be associated with multiple senses. Okay, so you might have a region of your brain that's associated with vision. It's also associated with hearing. Okay, and it's maybe closely associated with taste or smell. Okay? Well, sometimes those signals tend to get crossed, and so you might say, um, you might tell somebody a word. So you might say, or show somebody a number. Okay, you might say, all right, here's the number 5, and they might say, that's red, even though like it's the number 5 and it might be in black ink. They're associating that number, that vision or sound with a different sense. Okay? So this is normally what we call joined sensation. Okay? So that's when the brain interprets a stimulus as one sense coming from another. Okay, so it's a condition where you're not it's not the correct sense. It's a different sense. And there's a couple that are very common, and then there's some really uncommon ones, but in all, it's pretty uncommon. Okay, about 1 in every 2,000 people have a condition like this. Okay, like for example, if you have someone smell some paint, okay, and they're like, oh, the paint smelled blue. Okay, versus, the paint smelled like paint would smell like kind of chemical. They tell you it smells blue, and it doesn't matter. The paint color could be red, and they could smell it and say, "Oh, the paint smells blue." Okay, so it's a cross. It's this interpretation of the stimuli. Okay, we know in some regions that it's genetic mutations that have occurred in certain regions. Okay, it's said to be common in people that are creative, people that are abstract artists, people that think way outside the box. Sometimes they've been associated with these genetic mutations where they see the world in a different view, and it kind of allows them to be creative beyond what the normal person would ever think, because maybe they are seeing smell as a color. So maybe they smell a rose and they think, it's orange. That smell is associated with a color. Okay? So there's lots of ways at which this can occur. Some of the common ones, most common, is Garfini color type synthesis, okay, where a letter or a number evokes some kind of color. Okay, so you say the letter K, and they're like, that's black. Okay, lexial is when you can invoke kind of a name, and that name will give you kind of a taste or a smell. Okay, so you might say dog, and they might be like, oh, oranges, tastes like oranges, or smells like oranges. So like you have a name that would give a perception of some kind of taste or smell, even though they might not be associated with each other directly. Okay, so kind of a genetic mutation that kind of crosses some of these things up, but now we're going to figure out how some of these work. So let's start with olfaction. Let's start with the sense of smell. Okay, so you have olfactory receptor cells, chemoreceptors. Okay, so again, these are specialized receptor cells that are picking up chemicals out of the air, and they're deciphering what that chemical is. So that chemical is going to bond to a site on a protein, and that protein will change the channel. It'll allow for an impulse to happen. That action potential will be sent. Okay, then the central nervous system will eventually receive it, and then the brain will interpret what that chemical is, okay, based on the impulse that was sent. Right? So couple things that there's a direct connection, and so it's not surprising that when people smell things or lose their sense of smell, they might also lose their sense of taste, because most of the time when we do research and look at this, about 75 to 80% of all the taste is directly related to smell. Okay, so if you if you close off the nasal passage and you don't allow individuals to smell their food, only about 20% of the food that we eat have any taste without smell. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that. Okay, so let's talk about those olfactory organs. Okay, so the olfactory receptors are bipolar neurons. Okay, so we kind of already talked about what a bipolar neuron would look like. Okay, and we'll look at these here in a second. Okay, the interesting thing about them is they're going to have knobs at the distal end of their dendrites. Okay, that are covered with cilia, covered with little teeny hair-like projections. These little hair-like projections are loaded with proteins that can pick up different chemicals. Right? And so there's almost 400 types of olfactory membrane receptors, right? And you can get a combination. So when we're talking about the potential for us to smell things, we have an extreme ability to smell different smells, and you can get a combination of multiple receptors being stimulated at the same time. Those stimulations are going to send signals down the axon. The axon will then communicate those signals and transfer those signals to the brain. The brain will combine those signals and then give you one or a couple different senses of what it is that you might smell. Okay? So let's look at kind of how this works. So you have these nerve fibers that are coming in. So these nerve fibers are going to be connected eventually to the central nervous system. Okay? But off these nerve fibers, okay, through the cribriform plate, you're going to have nerves, bipolar nerves. Okay, so nerve body, axon, dendrite. Off the dendritic side, you're going to have these ciliated regions. Okay, those ciliated regions are going to be able to pick up chemicals. Okay, and they are going to pick up these different chemicals, send those signals. Those signals will be sent through the bipolar neuron to the nerve fiber with the olfactory bulb region. this olfactory bulb is going to pick up all the different chemicals, okay, and then send an action potential back towards the brain. All right. Once those olfactory receptors have been stimulated, okay, the nerve will then travel through the opening of the cribriform plate, which we talked about. That's the ethmoid bone. So this is kind of the path it takes. Olfactory nerve, olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, lymphatic system. Okay, so this gets into the emotion, and then olfactory cortex, sorry, that's for the interpretation of what's going on. Okay, so nerves to bulbs to tracts to lymphatic system for kind of the emotion of that smell, and then the olfactory cortex for the interpretation of what is that smell. Okay, olfactory bulbs are producing that sensory impulse. Okay, so remember we said you have sensory, okay, or sensation, perception, okay, and then kind of combining the two into interpretation. Okay, so that sensory bulb itself is what's producing the impulse, the sensory impulse. The limbic system, okay, this is associated with memory and emotion. Okay, and then that's where you get some emotions with the response to certain odors, and no emotion with other odors, because maybe you have no memory or no emotion associated with it. You can associate odors to emotion and memory. Okay, this is why individuals can smell a certain subject, and it might take them back to a time when they were a child. Okay, because they've associated that odor molecule with memory and emotion. And this often happens to young children who might have grandparents that they go and visit, maybe often or not so often, but their grandparents' house smells a certain way. Maybe they burn a certain candle. Excuse me, a certain candle or something like that. And then every time they smell that material, maybe that candle, or maybe fresh baked bread with a certain scent to it, okay, it takes them back to, man, that smells like my grandma's house. Okay, that's that connection. That limbic system is that connection between the odor and emotion and memory. Okay, now all those receptors being able to send signals that can then be combined by the olfactory bulb makes us be able to distinguish, at rough estimate, 1 trillion different odors. So 1 trillion different chemicals can be picked up by our nasal passage, by our nasal receptors. Okay? We can remember, it's suggested, we can remember around 50,000 different smells. Okay, so pretty impressive. Okay, and of course, not nearly impressive of other animals on the planet like dogs and things like that, but still, for humans that we often think we don't really use our olfactory pathways nearly as much as what other organisms do. We still can distinguish a lot of different chemicals and remember many, many different pathways. Okay, so the leading hypothesis on how this works, okay, so this is a hypothesis, okay, this is not a theory, okay, so if you remember back, hypotheses are tested, supported with evidence, okay, but a theory means that hypothesis has been tested many, many, many times and is supported with lots of evidence and hasn't been refuted. Okay, so this has not made it to a theory yet, but it is the leading hypothesis on how this works. All right, now we know this much. We know that every olfactory receptor cell contains one type of membrane protein. So that's able to pick up really one type of chemical. Okay. But each type of membrane protein can bind to several different odorants. Okay, so you have one type of membrane protein, several types of odorants. Okay, and the brain then combines those signals as an olfactory code. The other thing that goes with this hypothesis is that the receptors can undergo sensory adaptation very rapidly. So things that once might have triggered one type of impulse now may not trigger an impulse at all, or they might get less of an impulse. Okay, and this comes with environment. So individuals, and you probably know individuals that are associated with this. Okay, individuals that may smoke, they may not be able to smell tobacco smoke. So when they walk into an establishment or something like that, and or get into a car that someone had been smoking, and they may not be able to smell it, okay, because their olfactory passages are so adapted to smelling it constantly that there's no longer a reaction to it. Okay? The other thing is individuals that might be like an extreme athlete and always sweating, okay, they may not be able to smell their own sweat, okay, but to others, their sweat may be very potent, okay, and that's really because of that adaptation. Okay, same thing. Like a lot of times, you'll have individuals that are like working in industries where there's heavy smells, maybe a heavy chemical smell, like say a lifeguard at a pool or something like that, and they sit there and they smell chlorine all day long. After a while, they're not able to smell it any longer. They just don't notice it. They can't tell that pool has chlorine in it or not. And so there's lots of different ways at which this can be adaptive. The other thing is about 50% of a smell drops within 1 second of stimulation. Okay, so they can be very quick. These molecules are very quick, and they dissipate out very quickly. Again, I kind of just hit on this. Okay, receptor neurons can be damaged. They can be damaged with direct contact in the environment. They can be damaged with chemical damage. They can be damaged with viruses. They can be damaged over time. And the one thing that's really neat and unique, and researchers are always looking at this, is we have the ability to replace the neurons, the receptors in our nasal passage, our olfactory passage. We can replace these, and we replace them regularly, which is extremely rare for neurons in humans, especially as an adult. And so, but these neurons are replaced, and they're replaced often. And so this is why you can go from, let's say you do work at a pool and you are a lifeguard and you were for 10 years, and then you take a job elsewhere, okay, and you have been away from the pool area, and you don't get that smell all the time, okay, and then 2 years later or whatever, you come back and you're like, man, chlorine is nasty smelling. And it's because the neurons in that region have been replaced, and now you can smell that. Okay, and this often happens in many different industries. All right, gestation, or the sense of taste. Okay, so let's hit on taste real quick. Okay, so taste buds associated with smell. Okay, so we do these two kind of together. They're located on the papillae of the tongue, or the roof of the mouth, or the cheeks, and then the pharynx a little bit. Okay, we have about 10,000 taste buds. 50 to 150 taste cells associated with each taste bud. So quite a bit, but nothing compared to being able to distinguish 1 trillion different smells, okay, or 1 trillion different chemicals. Taste receptors, just like olfactory receptors, are chemoreceptors. Okay, so they're pulling chemicals. These chemicals happen to be in kind of a liquid form or semi-liquid form, and that's how they get past the cell barrier and entice a chemical change in the region. Okay, so you have modified epithelial cells that are the receptors. And they have microvilli just like you see in kind of in the nasal region associated with olfactory nerves. Okay, cilia or these little teeny hair-like projections, microvilli, same kind of thing. These little teeny hair-like projections, a little bit different than each other, but very, very similar to each other. Okay, and the other thing is the taste cells themselves are replaced about every 3 days. Okay, so if you burn your tongue and you destroy your taste buds in that region, give it about 3 days and you'll probably be able to taste in that region again. So let's look at kind of what this looks like in cross section. So you have these papillae, okay, so and if we look and dive into a taste bud, this is what it would look like. You have taste cells, which have these taste hair projectiles coming off, and those would just be loaded with proteins that are pulling chemicals in and deciphering what that chemical is because they're attached to a nerve fiber. You have these guard cells or supporting cells that provide kind of support and keep the rigidity of that structure and doesn't allow that structure to move much. Okay, and then you have these squamosa epithelium cells which form kind of this encapsulation. So there's a region at which on all your taste buds is open to the taste hair, but everything else is kind of covered and protected, and that protects it from abrasion, and so you're not knocking off the hairs and protects it from heat and other things. So when you destroy a region because you drank hot coffee too fast, okay, you're destroying this epithelium cells of the tongue. Okay, yes, you may be damaging these cells here. Okay, and if it's really a bad burn, you're gonna feel some pain. That's because you're damaging the nerves in this region. Okay, but again, it will replenish and it'll come back. Most likely, depends on the severity of the burn, but most likely it'll come back roughly 3 days, kind of thing. Okay, there are 5 primary tastes. Sweet. Okay, this is going to be stimulated by carbohydrates. Okay, if you remember back, carbohydrates is just a fancy name for sugars. Okay, they have some kind of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen kind of buildup, and carbohydrates are going to be that sweet. Sour is stimulated by acids. So hydrogen ions or protons. Okay, salty is stimulated by salt, so sodium, potassium. Okay, bitter is typically stimulated by things like magnesium, calcium, but there are lots of organic compounds that can give you a bitter taste. And umami is stimulated normally by long amino acids. Okay, or we can stimulate it by things like MSG. Okay, so this is kind of a map of the region of your tongue and where these taste buds are found. But don't get me wrong, like I don't want you to think only the back of your tongue can taste bitter. Okay, that's not true. The majority of the taste sensations for bitter are the back of your tongue. But that doesn't mean that each one of these regions don't have every one of these. They do. Every region of your tongue will have some of all of these. Okay, it's just what's here is what's dominating that region. So sweet is dominates the tip of the tongue, salty behind that, umami is in the middle, sour on the edges, and bitter in the back. Okay, and then normally when we're talking about flavor or results of the stimulation, okay, you can get sweet and sour, you know, both firing at the same time, and that gives you kind of that sweet sour, sweet sour, and the other thing is things like really spicy foods. You have pain receptors in this region too, and really spicy foods can entice pain receptors along with salt, sweet. So if you have a sweet, salty, spicy region, you might fire off some of the pain receptors. Okay, and those can associate kind of a flavor or a feeling, also an emotion, also. Okay, and finally, okay, the receptors in this region can undergo rapid adaptations. Okay, this is why some people, when you're young, you might not like the taste of something, and then as you age, you're like, wow, that's actually really good. I don't know why I didn't eat that. Or a lot of people dealt with this with the last viral outbreak in COVID, got really sick. Okay, you lost your sense of taste. Okay, it was associated mainly with you losing your sense of smell. Okay, so these two are coupled, and then when you got better, things don't taste the same anymore. Okay, because you have rapid adaptation to the regions of your taste buds and your receptors. Okay, again, kind of the impulse. So the main taste pathways follow three kind of different nerves, and it really depends on the location of the taste cell. Okay, so the facial nerve, the glossophageal nerve, or the vagus nerve. Okay, depending on where the taste is coming from, okay, that will determine what nerve is fired. So, like the tip of the tongue, you know, you're going to have one nerve that's associated with the tip of the tongue. You're going to have one nerve that's kind of associated with the middle or the back of the tongue, and then one that's further down in the pharynx that's associated with that. Okay, all of which are going to still send a signal to the nucleus of the solitarius in the medulla. Eventually, it will go to the thalamus, okay, or eventually it will come from the thalamus to that, okay, then the signal will get sent to the gastoria cortex, okay. The gastoria cortex is where we're going to interpret whatever that taste might be, okay. So cranial nerves are going to take and conduct that impulse into the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the region in the lower portion of the brain, the medulla oblongata. Okay, that impulse then proceeds to the thalamus. Okay, then the thalamus goes to the gastrodial cortex. Okay, and then that's the interpretation. Then you can send a signal back. Sometimes a signal is sent back, especially if it's something that's not pleasant, makes you want to gag, spit things out. That controls gag reflex. Okay, those muscles. If it's burning on the tongue, okay, that sensation will come back and tell you that your tongue's on fire. These kind of things. Okay. So you can have smell and taste disorders. Remember, these are connected, and often this happens like to people constantly. You have a clogged up nose, which means you have, mucus or potentially bacteria or viruses that are clogging regions where you're not getting that good connection between the chemicals in the air and the olfactory nerves, okay? Which means that when you take a bite of something and that smell is not there, okay, and now you don't have the ability to smell or taste a certain material. So when individuals have colds, flu, allergies, nasal polyps, okay, when they have swollen mucous membranes, okay, if you get hit in the head and you have a head injury, okay, that may cause swelling around certain nerves. If you break your nose, okay, and you have swelling in that region around the nerves. If you've been exposed to toxins or lots of different things. COVID-19, okay, was a big one. And that caused, in some people, permanent damage, and other people just temporary damage. So sometimes it's temporary, like a cold or flu. Often they're temporary. A broken nose could be permanent. A head injury could be permanent. Damage to by toxic chemicals could cause permanent damage in the nasal region, not allowing you to taste things. And often there's a problem with us connecting those dots. So if you went to a doctor during COVID, after you got COVID, if you were so unlucky to get it, if you went into a doctor and said, "Hey, I can't smell and taste anything," and then after COVID, you came back and you say, "I have these phantom smells." Like, for example, myself, I got COVID and multiple times, and now I can smell smoke. I'm not a smoker, and no one in my family smokes, but I get phantom smoke smells. Okay, I'll just be sitting doing nothing, maybe watching TV, reading a book, and all of a sudden I smell cigarette smoke. Okay? Never smoked in my life, and it's just this phantom stuff. Okay, that often, like, the identification, it can't be identified. There was permanent damage to some kind of receptor in my nasal passage. One of those receptors is been permanently damaged, and now it's probably a different chemical in the air that I associate with smoke, that is not smoke. And then, of course, there's lots of drugs and medication that can alter the smell and taste of different material, as as you're exposed to it.